Now compared to a penny, you can see that the 22 LR is a very puny round, and believe it or don't, that is a big reason why the 22 LR is so successful. 22 LR is a rim-fired cartridge, and judging by the foundation of the entire cartridge, you can see that it's wider than the side walls, so that implies that it is a rimmed cartridge, and I'm honestly not sure if the 22 LR is slightly tapered, if it's a straight walled cartridge, but the fact that you can load them into banana mags seems to imply, at least to me, that it just might be slightly tapered. The overall length of the 22 long rifle is about an inch long, while its diameter is 0.223 inches, and it is indeed a 22 caliber, and there are a lot of other 22 caliber rounds out there, and many of them are quite popular, and most of them are center fire. 223 Remington and 22 250 are some of the ones, just to name a few. Now, in order to alleviate some of the confusion, most of the time when you hear the term 22, it refers to the 22 LR specifically. Now, as I have mentioned, it is a 22 caliber. So let's compare that, let's say, to a 223 Remington. Now, I found this spent shell casing at a gun range, and you can see how the 22 LR fits almost in there perfectly, which kind of gives you an idea how a 22 caliber is measured. But technically, I think the 223 Remington is technically 0.224 inches in diameter, so it would be just slightly wider in diameter than the 22 LR. It is a tapered heel bullet where the enclosed part of the bullet is smaller than the lowest visible part. Visible base part of the bullet itself runs perfectly flush with the side of the cartridge. And to kind of give you a little bit more of an example, let's look at this 9mm. Kind of hard to see, but if you could hear that clicking, that's an indicator that the shell casing is just slightly wider than the widest part of the diameter in the 9mm. There are different variations. This one is a full metal jacket, hollow point, while this one has a wax sealing around the lead bullet, and it's a round nose. And in terms of velocity, there are subsonics, there's standard velocity, high velocity, and hypervelocity. And when it comes to grain, you'll find them measured, or weighed rather, in between 30 grain to 40 grain. As I have already mentioned, the tiny size of the cartridge is a big contributing factor to its popularity. With no felt recoil, it is a very ideal round for inexperienced shooters. And individually speaking, it is possibly the cheapest round available, even cheaper than 9mm. What's really neat too is you can buy boxes that have as many as 500 rounds or even more. They also come in smaller boxes with as few as 50 rounds. And there are also boxes with in-between numbers, such as this one. With its cheaper cost and its minimal recoil, not only do novice shooters favor the 22 LR, but it's also enjoyed by professional shooters. And it's a very cheap way on how to target practice and improve marksmanship. And if I remember correctly, in times past, even the military have trained with 22 LRs. I'm honestly not sure if that's still the case today. And because 22 long rifle is so popular, there's been at least 2 ammo shortages, or two shortages specifically on 22 LR within a decade's time. And just like with 9mm, when the ammo shortage began nearly 2 years ago, 22 LR was amongst the first to have disappeared from off the shelf. Not only is 22 long rifle a favored caliber in America, but it's also favored throughout the entire world. It just might even be more popular than 9mm. And a very neat thing too is they make 22 LRs in literally any action. Pump, lever action, AR platforms, you name it. This Heritage Rough Rider is the only 22 LR that I own. It's actually my wife's. I bought it for her as a wedding present. And she loves it. She swears by 22. Not only is the 22 LR good for target practice, improving your marksmanship, or just for recreational plinking, it's also a good round for hunting smaller animals. It does have its limit though, just like every other caliber. For example, its most effective range, some people say, is 50 yards. Other people say 150 yards at the maximum. However, based off the right conditions, the right gun, the right skills, etc., the 22 LR can kill as far as a mile. So it's definitely not a round at all to underestimate. I actually witnessed one time, several years back at a gun range, there was a guy who was recreational shooting with a double action revolver, and he was aiming at an orange clay pigeon. And I remember him just setting up, aiming. He took his time, took quite a while to aim, but once he pulled the trigger from, I don't know how far it was, but it was quite a ways off, but not far enough away to we couldn't see the clay pigeon just shatter. And I was very impressed. Now, 22 LR is not a recommended round for self-defense. Now, don't get me wrong, 22 LRs can kill, but it's just not very effective, or not ideal, I should say. They say that the minimal size of a caliber to be used for self-defense would be the 380 ACP, because apparently, even though, as I've already mentioned, the 22 can kill somebody, but when your adrenaline is rushing and somebody's coming at you, there have been instances where the aggressor did not feel the pain or feel being shot, or wasn't incapacitated fast enough by a 22. And it certainly is not legal to hunt larger game with the 22 either, even though you can take down a large animal, as long as you have the right marksmanship, right gun, etc. But I do not recommend it, and I do not encourage anybody whatsoever to go out and do something like that. 22 LR is also notorious for ricocheting, and it certainly is not a good brush gun, and it will tumble when fired through some thick brush. This cartridge has been around for a very long time. In fact, it's been around even longer than a lot of the modern day rounds that are still very popular, including 9mm, 30-30 Winchester, 30-06, and 38 Special. But how far back do the 22 LR's origins really go? Right when you were feeling amazed how small the 22 LR is, you just might be surprised that there are a few smaller cartridges out there. This one is a 22 short, and the 22 LR actually is the grandchild of the 22 short. Now, there is an awful lot of history to how the 22LR was developed, and I did touch briefly on that in my Heritage Rough Rider video, but I want to elaborate on its history a little bit more in this one. But since there is an awful lot of history, I'll try and make a long story short. Now, the 22LR's origins technically began in the year 1845 in France by a man named Louis Flaubert. He had made the first metallic cartridge. It was the 22 BB cap, and he made it very specifically for indoor shooting. And then in the year 1857, so 12 years later, Smith & Wesson took the 22 BB cap and they developed the 22 short off it, and they chambered it in their first single-action revolver, which was small enough to fit in a pocket, and it became very popular for close-range self-defense, and because its velocity and ballistics really weren't all that impressive, it became more of a gallery or recreational round. Even though it's not as popular as it used to be, it ironically is still made today, and it is indeed the oldest cartridge that is still made today, and it was the first metallic cartridge made in the United States. Now, come the year 1871, the 22 long was invented, and it was based off the 22 short. Now, the 22 long is not as common today as it once was, and even though you can find it occasionally, it is starting to become obsolete. So that's a big reason why I don't have one now, and certainly isn't any easier to find one these days with the current circumstances. But just to give you an idea of what a 22 long looks like, it has the same length of shell casing as a 22LR with the same bullet diameter as the 22 short, and that bullet diameter is just slightly smaller than the 22LR. I believe the diameter measurement is 0.222 as opposed to 0.223. So fast forward 9 years later, around 1880, another cartridge was fabricated or born from the 22 long, and that was the 22 extra long, and it was even longer than the 22 long rifle, but it had the same bullet diameter, and it performed okay, but it was a little less accurate than the 22 long and 22 short. And even though I have heard, and I did say in my Heritage Rough Rider video, that the 22 LR was developed in the year 1884, and I did hear that from one or two sources. I've heard more sources say that it was developed closer to 1887, and the company who developed that was Stevens Arms. So what they did then was they basically took the bullet of the 22 extra long and they fitted in the shell casing of the 22 long, and thus the 22 LR was born. Now, what was really neat about the 22 LR was it did just about, if not better, in performance to the 22 extra long, but it was far more accurate, and its popularity took off really quickly, whereas a 22 extra long eventually became obsolete around 1935. It amazes me how a caliber could be so successful that it stands the test of time for well over a century. In the case of the 22 short, it's been around for well over a century and a half. And there you go. Very simple and brief overview of the 22 LR. I really do hope that you found this video informative and at least a little bit enjoyable. And if you want to shoot a gun for the first time, I highly recommend you start out with the 22 LR. Take care.